Sabbath Wells, Arizona Territory, 1884, the dry white heart of September. The kind of heat that stands in the street like a third party to every conversation and makes a careful man careless just to feel the air move. The Roman saloon sat at the head of the only street like a courthouse that had stopped pretending to be anything else. And everyone who came through its doors came soft. Because in Sabbath Wells the quickest way a man ever bought himself a grave was to be told in front of witnesses that he had just bought a fair fight. Here is the thing the country outside had never quite understood about Sabbath Wells, and it is the whole of this story, so hold it. Nobody in that valley was murdered. Every last man who went into the ground on the ridge above town had died in a fair fight, drawn against, gun out first, dropped clean in front of the marshal. And a fair fight is not a crime in any territory of the United States. It is a tragedy, and a tragedy has no defendant. A patient man had learned that a bought marshal and a fast hand could empty a whole valley of its small ranchers one funeral at a time, and never once stand before a judge, because you cannot indict a duel. At a corner table with his back to the wall, a stranger sat with a glass of whiskey he had not touched in an hour. He was not drinking it. He was letting it stand there and watching the room over the top of it, the way a man watches a river he means to cross, learning where it runs deep. He had ridden into Sabbath Wells that morning on a black horse, and he had asked nobody a single question, and that alone had made 3 men in the room nervous. Because in a town run by fear, the one thing that cannot be allowed is a man who does not seem afraid. The stranger was somewhere in his middle 40s, lean and sun-cured, a brown felt hat pulled low. A faded, patterned wool poncho gone pale, with the dust of 100 roads, a blue neckerchief, and a single-worn Colt riding in a plain holster with a hammer down on an empty chamber, the way men carry who mean to be alive in the morning. He had learned a thing a long time ago, and it had cost him everything a thing can cost, and the thing was this. A fast man kills the one who moves. A patient man kills the one who is sure. And Sabbath Wells was the surest town he had ever ridden into. The valley had a king, and his name was Colonel Dax Renard, 53, straight in the back, gray at the temple. A man who had raised volunteer cavalry in the war and had come home to the territory with the calm conviction of a man who has learned that the world is only a supply problem. Renard did not rustle cattle. Rustling was for men without imagination, and it left a rope waiting at the end of it. Renard wanted the whole valley, the creek and the benches and the little quarter sections of grass that the homestead law had let poor men fence off from his range, and he had found the one method the law could not reach. He imported it. He paid, out of an account that touched half the banks in the territory, for professional shootists, men whose entire trade was to walk up to a small rancher in a public place, insult him past bearing, and be there, ready, when the rancher's pride finally reached for his gun. The rancher drew first. The shootist, faster, killed him. The marshal, watching, wrote it down as a fair fight in self-defense, and there was never any crime, and within a season the widow sold the grass to the only buyer in the valley for the only price he offered. In 3 years, 11 small ranchers along Sabbath Creek had died in fair fights, and every one of the 11 had, according to the marshal's own testimony, drawn first. And 11 men in a row drawing first against professionals is not luck, and it is not cowardice on the professional's part. It is a business. But you would have to be able to count to see it, and Sabbath Wells had been taught not to count out loud. The man who did the killing was Emmett Cade, 34, out of the Nueces country in Texas, and Emmett Cade had put 21 men in the ground and could tell you the name of every one. He was not loud. The loud ones die young. He was quiet and courteous, and he wore a Greytown coat and clean cuffs, and his tell, the one thing that gave him away to a man who knew what to look for, was that Emmett Cade never spoke first and never moved first. Ever. Because his whole life and his whole legal safety depended on the other man doing both. He would stand in front of you and say nothing, and let your own fear do the work of loading the gun, and when your hand finally twitched he would be a quarter of a second faster, always, and the law would shake his hand. He had 2 men with him, Reuben Voss, 29, a heavy, quiet Missourian who worked with a knife and with his hands and did the things that could not be dressed up as fair, the barn accidents and the horses that came home empty, and Lonzo Pike, 40, thin as a rail, who kept to the rooftops with a rifle and had never once been seen at a killing, which was exactly the point of him. And over all of it, wearing a star the county had elected in good faith and Rennert had bought in private, stood Marshal Owen Sipe, 46, a big, sad-eyed man who had been honest once and could tell you the year he stopped, and whose entire office now consisted of standing near the fair fights and swearing, afterward, that he had seen the dead man draw first. He had sworn it 11 times. He had begun to believe it. The way a man believes a thing, he needs to sleep. There was a boy in it, because there is always someone the swindle costs the most, and in Sabbath Wells it was a boy of 14 named Ossatel, whose father had run 40 horses on the best water on the creek and had died in the street 3 days before the stranger rode in. Harmon Tell had been a slow, decent man who had never drawn a gun in anger in his life, and Emmett Cade had stood in front of him outside the Mercantile and said a thing about Harmon's dead wife, said it slow and clear so the whole street would hear. And Harmon Tell had reached, the way any man with a heart in him would reach, and that was all it took. Now the boy Asa lived in the livery loft and did not speak, and his mother was 3 winters dead, and the 40 horses and the good water would go to probate on the 20th of the month, and there was exactly 1 bidder in the valley, and everyone in Sabbath Wells knew the boy would be walking out of the country by October with nothing. And no law in the territory said otherwise, because his father had drawn first. On the stranger's first evening in town he watched Emmett Cade work, and it was a thing to see if you had the stomach for it. A young rancher named Del Furlong had come in off the south bench to sell a wagon of hides, and Cade found him at the bar and began, quiet and pleasant, to take him apart. A word about his herd, a word about his wife, a word about the way he wore his gun, each one a small stone laid on a scale, and the whole room went still and studied its own hands, because the whole room had watched this exact machine run 11 times and knew there was no stopping it once the first stone was laid. And the stranger, at his table, did the one thing nobody in Sabbath Wells had done in 3 years. He stood up, and he walked between them, unhurried, and he set his untouched whiskey down on the bar at Del Furlong's elbow, and he said to the young rancher, not to Cade, "Go home, son. Your wife is a better argument than anything in this room." And then he turned his back on Emmett Cade, which no living man had done, and he looked at the fastest gun in the territory with something that was almost kindness, and said, "You have to wait for him to move. That is the sad little secret of your whole trade, and I have known it since I was younger than that boy in your livery. You cannot start it. You can only finish it. Which means, mister, that everything you are depends entirely on the nerve of frightened men, and I am not a frightened man, and I am going to be in this town a while." Emmett Cade said nothing, because Emmett Cade never spoke first, but a muscle moved once along his jaw, and every soul in the Roman saloon saw it, and for the first time in 3 years the fear in Sabbath Wells had a crack in it. Now, before the rest of this happens, you need to understand how the fair fight really worked in the real West, because it was not the thing the dime novels sold, and it was not the thing on a courthouse lawn at high noon. The duel, the provoked and lawful killing, was one of the last great loopholes in a frontier that was running out of loopholes. A man could not be hanged for defending himself, and the whole doctrine of self-defense turned on one question, and one question only: who drew first? And that question was answered not by God and not by the truth, but by whoever was standing close enough to swear to it. In a town with an honest marshal, the fair fight was a rare and terrible thing between 2 angry men. In a town with a bought marshal, the fair fight was a business model. The professionals understood, better than any lawyer, that they did not need to win a gunfight so much as they needed to win the sentence that came after it, the marshal's flat sworn word. he drew first. And once you owned the man who said those 3 words, you could clear a valley of its rightful owners and call every clearing a tragedy and dare the territory to prove otherwise. And the territory never could, because the only witnesses who might have said different were the ones on the ridge under the fresh dirt. This is the part the stranger had understood on his first evening. Sitting over a whiskey he would not drink. He could not beat Emmett Cade at the thing Emmett Cade was best at on earth, and he had no intention of trying. Speed was the trap, not the answer. The whole of Sabbath Wells was built on a single sentence he drew first, sworn by one bought and broken man, and a thing built on one man's word can be pulled down by making that one man choose, in front of the whole town, between his soul and his salary. But that would take a day when the town was gathered and a mouth that could not lie its way clear, and it happened that the country was about to hand the stranger both, because the circuit judge was coming. Judge Alden Rue rode the circuit through Sabbath Wells 4 times a year to clear the docket and settle the probates, and he was due on the 20th, the very day the boys' 40 horses would go to the block, and a circuit judge does not travel alone. He came with a court clerk and a deputy United States Marshal for an escort, and on the day he sat, the whole valley came to town, because Court Day was the one honest carnival the country had. On Court Day there would be 200 people in the street who had each buried a neighbor in a fair fight and swallowed it, and there would be a judge with a federal deputy at his shoulder, and there would be Marshal Owen Sipe required by his office to be present and sworn. The stranger did not send for anyone. He did not need to. He only had to be alive on the 20th, in the open, with the whole town watching, and make Emmett Cade do the one thing Emmett Cade had built his entire life never to do. Move first. So the stranger stayed. He stayed 6 days, and he did nothing anyone could point to, and the doing nothing was the loudest thing that had happened in Sabbath Wells in 3 years. He ate at the hotel in plain sight. He curried his black horse in the street. He sat on the boardwalk in the evening and let the valley look at a man who was not afraid, and men rode in from the benches just to look, because a town that has agreed to be afraid will travel a long way to see somebody who has not signed the agreement. He spent an hour a day at the livery, not talking, just working alongside the silent boy, mending harness, and on the 4th day the boy Asa spoke his first words in a week, which were, he said my mother's name, Mr. He said it out loud so everybody would hear. And the stranger did not look up from the leather and said, I know he did. And that is the last free thing he will ever do. Colonel Renard heard about the stranger on the 2nd day, and unlike a lesser man, he did not send Emmett Cade out to hurry it. He understood, the way Cade understood, that their whole machine required the other man to move. And a man who would not move was not a problem you could solve with the machine. He was a problem you had to wait out or buy off. So on the 5th day Renard sent for the stranger and received him in the long cool room of his ranch house with good brandy and a courteous smile. And he offered the stranger a thing he had never had to offer anyone in the valley, which was money to ride on, $500 in gold to be gone by morning. And the stranger looked at the gold and looked at the colonel and said, You have never once in 3 years given an order, have you? You let a pleasant man insult a rancher, and you let the rancher's own pride pull the trigger, and you let a broke marshal swear to it, and you sit here with clean hands and good brandy, and you believe you have never killed anybody. Colonel, I am not going to draw on your man, because that is the one gift you have to give, and I will not take it. I am going to stand in your street on Court Day and do nothing at all, and your man is going to have to decide, in front of 200 people and a federal deputy, whether to let me stand there, which ends the fear you rent this valley with, or to move first, which ends him. You have built a machine that only runs one direction, and I am going to make it run the other. Keep your goal. It is the boy's water it bought, and it will choke you. The morning of the 20th of September came up hot and hard and clear, and Sabbath Wells field from every trail at once. The judge's coach came in at 9, with the clerk beside him and the deputy United States Marshal riding escort. a lean gray man named Dana, who had ridden a long way and said little. And the court set up in the Roman saloon because it was the only room in town big enough, and the whole valley packed the street outside to hear the probates read through the open doors. And the first matter on the docket, because the dead have to be settled before the living can be, was the estate of Harmon Tell, deceased, 40 horses, and 1/4 section of creek water, 1 bidder of record, Colonel Dax Renard. The boy Asa stood at the front with his hat in his hands. And the stranger stepped out into the middle of the street, into the wide sunlit space that the crowd left around the saloon doors, and he stood there in his dusty poncho with the sun full on him and his hands loose and empty at his sides, and he did nothing. He simply stood where the whole town, and the judge in the doorway, and the federal deputy could all see him, in the open, waiting. And everybody in Sabbath Wells understood at once what he was doing, because they had all watched the machine run 11 times, and they knew there was one man in that valley who could not abide being stood in front of, and here he came. Emmett Cade came out through the crowd in his gray coat and his clean cuffs, and he walked into the open space and stopped 10 paces from the stranger, and he did the thing he always did, which was to stand still and say nothing and let the other man's fear do the loading. Only this time the other man had no fear to give him. The stranger looked at Emmett Cade across 10 paces of white sunlight, with the whole valley holding its breath, and he said the thing that Sabbath Wells would repeat around its stoves for 30 years. "You were taught the draw," he said, easy and clear, so the judge in the doorway would hear every word. "Somebody spent a lot of years teaching you the fastest hand in the territory, but nobody ever taught you to wait, because your kind cannot afford to wait, and that is the whole of your ruin. Mister, I can stand here all day. Can you? There is a judge in that door and a United States Marshal at his shoulder and 200 people who have buried their friends on your say-so, and every one of them is watching your hands. If I stand here and you kill me, they all saw you move first, and that is a hanging, and the Marshal cannot swear me down because I never reached. And if I stand here and you do not kill me, then Sabbath Wells has just watched Emmett Cade let a man stand in front of him and live, and after today they will never be afraid of you again. So there it is. Draw first and hang, or stand there and be finished. That is the fair fight, Emmett. That is the one you never learned to win." And Emmett Cade, 34 years old, 21 men in the ground, faster than any hand in the territory, stood in the white sun with the whole world watching his hands, and felt, for the first time in his life, the exact thing he had spent 11 killings putting into other men. He felt the loading of it. He felt his own pride reach the place where a slow, decent rancher's pride had reached 11 times, and he knew, with the clarity of a man watching his own funeral, that he could not stand there and be unmade in front of the valley he ruled. And so he did the thing his whole life had been built to make other men do. He moved first. His hand went for the gray coat. Bang! It was the only shot fired in Sabbath Wells that day, and it did not come from the stranger's gun the way the town would tell it later. It came a quarter of a second after Cade cleared leather, and it took Emmett Cade through the shoulder of his gun arm and spun him down into the dust of the street he had ruled, alive, disarmed, and finished. And the stranger stood over him with the Colt just level, and his voice went out flat over the silent town. "He drew first," the stranger said, loud, to the judge in the doorway, to the federal deputy, to the 200. Every man here saw it. Emmett Cade drew first, in front of a circuit judge and a United States Marshal, and there is your fair fight, and there is the end of it. Then he holstered, and he looked down at the man in the dust, and he did the thing the Channel's kind of man always does, which is that he did not kill him. He taught him. "You are going to live," he said, "and you are going to stand trial, not for a fair fight, because this one truly was, but for the 11 that were not. Because a man who will draw first in front of a judge to save his pride will talk in a cell to save his neck, and you are going to name the colonel and the marshal and every stone you ever laid, because that is the last fast thing you have left in you." Marshal Owen Sipe was standing in the saloon doorway when it happened, required by his office to be there, and Judge Alden Rue turned in his chair and looked at his marshal with the whole court watching and asked him the only question that mattered, the one Sipe had answered 11 times in the dark and had never once been asked in the light. "Marshal," said the judge, "you have sworn to 11 fair fights in this valley in 3 years. You just watched this one with your own eyes. Was that man drawn on, or did he draw?" And Owen Sipe, 46 years old, honest once and able to tell you the year he stopped, stood in the doorway with 200 of his neighbors looking at his face, and he opened his mouth to say the 3 words he had said 11 times, he drew first. And he found that in the full light of a court day with the boy Ossatel staring up at him, the 3 words would not come. He stood there a long time. And then he took off the star the county had given him in good faith, and he set it on the judge's table, and he said, in the flat, sick voice of a man doing the worst arithmetic of his life out loud, "They all drew first, Judge, because Cade made them, and I swore to it 11 times for $400 a season. And there are 11 men on that ridge who ought to be standing in this street. God help me. Write it all down." And the court clerk wrote it all down, and the federal deputy named Dana closed his notebook and walked out into the street and put Emmett Cade under a United States arrest before the colonel's lawyers could reach a horse. And the 20th of September in Sabbath Wells became the day the fair fight died. Here is what the day bought, because you should have all of it and not only the warm part. The boy's probate never went to the block. Judge Rue struck Colonel Renard's single bid off the record the moment the marshal's confession went into it, on the grounds that an estate manufactured by a fraud upon the court cannot be sold to the man who manufactured it, and the 40 horses and the good creek water went back to Asatel, 14 years old, to be held in trust till he was of age, and he holds that water today, and the grass goes green along Sabbath Creek every spring on ground that no colonel on this earth has any paper on. Emmett Cade stood trial at the territorial court, and he talked, exactly as the stranger had promised he would, because a man who lives by being fast cannot bear a slow death in a cell. And he named the stones one by one, and he was hanged for the 11, and he named his mother at the end, the way the men he killed had named their wives. Reuben Voss ran and was taken at the border. Lonzo Pike, who had never once been seen at a killing, was never charged with a thing, because you cannot indict a man for being on a roof, and he drifted west and hired out again, because the rooftops of the West are never empty for long. Marshal Owen Sipe was tried for the 11 false oaths, and he did not defend himself, and he went to the territorial prison for a long stretch. And the men in the street said it was too little, and the men on the ridge said nothing at all, and both were right. And Colonel Dax Renard was never hanged, because there was no order anybody had ever heard him give, no insult he had ever spoken, no trigger he had ever touched, nothing in his clean, courteous hand but brandy and good manners and a checkbook that had somehow understood for 3 years exactly which ranchers needed to feel unwelcome. The court fined the Renard land and cattle interests for the frauds of their employees, and the fine came to a little less than the colonel had paid Emmett Cade in wages over 3 years. And he paid it the way a gentleman pays a losing hand at cards, promptly and without complaint. And he kept his range and his ranch house and his brandy, and the only thing he lost was the valley floor. The little quarter sections he had killed 11 men to reach, which stayed now in the hands of the widows and the boy. And now the colder part, because this account owes you a true ending and not a warm one. In a paneled office a long way east, on a street named LaSalle in the city of Chicago, a soft-spoken lawyer named Silas Marchbanks read the newspaper account of the Sabbath Wells matter once, the way a man reads a weather report for a country he will never visit, and he did not care about a boy or a marshal's tears or a fast man hanged. He cared about the one useful sentence in the whole affair, which was that the method had a flaw, and the flaw was that a fair fight requires a fast man, and a fast man can be made to draw first, and a fast man in a cell will talk. And Silas Marchbanks, who had never in his life stood in a dusty street and had learned long ago that the surest way to empty a valley is to never once raise your voice, took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote a short memorandum to his Western clients, advising that henceforth no interest of theirs should ever again employ a shootist, or provoke a fair fight, or rely upon a marshal's oath, all of which could be caught and made to talk, and that instead the clients should avail themselves of the tax rolls and the mortgage courts by which a small rancher's water can be taken for a delinquent assessment he was never properly notified of, at a cost of a filing fee and a notice pinned to a courthouse door with no gun drawn, no man dead, no witness on any roof, and nothing for a circuit judge to strike, because a tax sale is not a tragedy and a foreclosure is not a fair fight, and there is no man on any street for a stranger to stand in front of. He fixed it. Not the theft. The gunfight. Next spring, in some other valley, the best water will go to the client with the most affidavits and the cleanest paper, in broad daylight, with a docket number and a county seal, and the small ranchers will be turned out lawfully for sums they cannot pay. And no fast man will die, and no marshal will weep, and no stranger on a black horse will have one solitary thing to stand in front of, because you cannot make a filing fee draw first. That is what a man like Marchbanks does with a day like the one in Sabbath Wells. He does not hunt the stranger. He reads him, closes the one door the stranger found open, and makes the next valley too lawful to shoot. The stranger rode out of Sabbath Wells on the morning after the court day. The boy Asatel walked the black horse to the edge of town, past the ridge with its 11 graves, and he tried to give the stranger the only thing he had, which was his father's watch. And the stranger closed the boy's fingers over it and told him that water is a thing you keep with lawyers now and not with courage, and to grow up mean enough with paper to hold what his father had died holding. The boy asked him where he was going. Nowhere in particular, the stranger said. That is the whole trick of it. And behind him a valley that had buried its neighbors by the calendar for 3 years put up its hay in peace, and a long way east a soft-spoken man turned a page with a clean, dry hand and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. The bounty on a man with no name and a black horse went up that month by $500, posted by nobody. And the territorial paper ran 6 inches on a strange court day in Sabbath Wells and never once printed the name of the rendered land and cattle interests. He was not happy. Men like him do not get happy. They only get a little further down the road and a little more alone at every gate, carrying the arithmetic of the ones they got to and the ones they did not. He rode south into the white heat toward whatever was waiting on the road ahead. Before you go, I need one thing from you. Comment below. 3 words. Where are you from? The country, the city, the place you are listening from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know who is out here on this road in the dark with me. This was the story of Sabbath Wells, a valley that was emptied one fair fight at a time, a fast man who never learned to wait, and a stranger who understood that you do not beat a duelist by being faster, you beat him by refusing to be afraid and making his own quick hand the rope that hangs him. Where does he ride from here? Comment below and help me decide. Subscribe so you do not miss the day he finally rides east to the paneled office on the street called LaSalle and a clean, dry hand and the man who learned to empty a valley with a filing fee. And tell me one more thing. Which one do you believe truly ruled that country? The fastest gun in the territory, or the soft-spoken lawyer who never once had to draw? Like this video if you believe the real enemy was never the man with the fast hand, but the bought oath and the courteous checkbook and the lawful little tax notice that can take a boy's water without firing one shot. See you on the next road.